Adams with Program 3 in Series 2 of the Sewing Connection. We'll be adding a waistband to that skirt we fit last time. Regardless of what the pattern provides, you can make changes in the type and size of the band you apply. I'll illustrate this with belts to show you the differences in the choices and the optical illusions you might produce. First of all, a contour belt. That's one that's curved like this. It's shaped. And this is going to start at the waist and go on down. What that means is that this will be good for someone with, long legs but a short torso, and you want to lengthen that torso, then bring it down into the body a little bit more, and you can look longer waisted that way. This is also really good for anyone who complains that, but I don't really have a waistline. I'd like to wear a belt, but I don't have much of one. Then instead of one that goes up above your waist, since you don't have much there, go on below your waist like this, and maybe it'll be more flattering. Try it and see what happens. Or the other alternative would be a straight belt. And anytime you have a straight one, that always starts at your waist and goes on up from there. And in doing this, notice how it would probably make my legs look a little bit longer, but it would make my torso look shorter. Well, you decide which way you'd rather go. Notice also, though, with this one, with all the colors and the contrasts in it, how it probably brings attention to your waist. And if you don't want to say, hey, look at me, then you better not do anything with such contrasts. Instead, come down to something more somber. I don't know that this is. Maybe it's a little bit less attracted to the waist. Your eye is a little less attracted, and so perhaps that's a good idea if you don't really want to call attention to your waist. Here's one that's a little bit wider. Now this is also a straight belt. It's not a contour, but the fact that it's wider in front and yet it does get narrower on the side. Now notice how high that one comes up in front. You could do the same things not only with belts but on waistbands. So it's kind of a good way to decide what looks best on you by just trying on a belt and seeing what happens, and then you can do a waistband accordingly, because usually in the pattern there is one included, but there's no reason why you couldn't make it shaped like this or make it wider or narrower than what they said it was going to be or what they had planned on it being. Notice also, before I put this wide one down, notice also that this does taper down to something narrower at the sides, because if you had this wide all the way around, it would not only probably be uncomfortable and that you couldn't bend very easily, but also it would be less flattering. So anytime they're very wide, they're usually a little bit better if they're also shaped, and it gives you a little bit better illusion there. Well, anyway, whatever you saw in these belts, you can do the same thing in your waistbands. For instance, this one does have a contour band on it, and this contour waistband is curved, of course, and this also would start at the waist and it would go down from there. It would not come up above the waist at all. That means with this one you couldn't wear a belt very easily. It wouldn't be covering the skirt unless it would also be a contour belt. So think that through. A little narrow belt, then perhaps you better have some belt carriers here to keep it in place so that it would stay at your waist instead of slipping up and avoiding the skirt completely. But this again is good for someone maybe who says, I don't really have a sharp indentation there. Or maybe I have a really sharp one. Maybe your rib cage is out here and suddenly you have that hidden waistline and then right back out for your hips. Well, this might be a solution. Try it and see. Here's another one. Now that first one was shaped. It got narrower on the sides and wider in the middle and narrower again on the side. It was more shaped. This one is pretty much the same size all the way around. Another contoured waist, but it's pretty much the same width. So this may or may not be flattering. All you can do, try a piece on with paper or whatever and see what you like before you actually cut out your belt. And then if you do make a straight waistband, as usually the pattern has, here's one that has interfacing inside it. And the reason for that interfacing is, of course, to stiffen it, because you don't want it to just bend over and wrinkle. You want it to stay stiff when it's on your waist. Keep it out. So that's what the interfacing is going to do. And then this one is the same belt, or the same waistband, in that it's straight. It's also a narrow one. These reach about 1 inch wide. But this one, notice, has elastic in it. Now the reason I did elastic in this is because I hear so many women say, I'm not the same size every day. I'm not even the same size from morning to night. I might vary 2 inches or more in a few hours' time. Therefore, if you put in that waistband elastic instead of interfacing, it might make it more comfortable to wear any time of day or night or whenever. So that's another thought. You might just want to do one of those. Well, to apply these, I'm going to first do one that is the interfacing, and there are a whole lot of commercial ones on the market. You can also, just from any piece of interfacing that you buy by the yard, you can cut your own interfacing and belt. How wide you like it is up to you. I usually like mine kind of narrower. Most of mine are only about an inch wide, possibly a little less on some of them, because that's my personal preference. That doesn't say it's right or wrong. There is no right or wrong. It's what do you like? What do you feel best in? So, personal preference here is a narrow one. I therefore might cut down this commercial interfacing that I buy. I might cut it down a little bit narrower. There are several of these on the market. They all look very similar. They all work very well. And what they are is perforated strips like this of a fusible interfacing, and you fuse it down to the back side of the belt, and then of course it snaps on the perforations and folds over. So this is very easy to use. As I said, you can cut your own, but it's kind of easy to get a head start with one of these commercial preparations that are all ready for you. Now what I usually do when I make one like this, because I do like mine a little bit narrower, I usually cut some of it off. Now notice with this that these aren't equal. These two sides aren't. One is narrower, one's wider. If you actually want to have this narrowed a little bit, what I would probably do is cut down the wide one and use it for the front side, this wide for instance. About 3/4, 7/8 is what I've cut it here. And then use the one that is now a little bit longer than it for the back. Now they always are that way. They're never completely evenly divided. The longer one is meant to be the back so that you can stitch it down by machine and catch the back side of it. So what I've done is just reverse it. I've cut the back of it shorter, so now it becomes the front, and then the former front will become the back. If you want it considerably narrower, cut both of them down. Whatever is your personal preference, whatever you feel most comfortable in. So go through your skirts and pants and try them on and see which one it is that you really enjoy wearing the most because, perhaps, of the width of the waistband. Then to actually get this fusing done either on press or on a with an iron and an ironing board, as I'm going to do here since I'm only doing a few inches of it, this is just pressed to the back side. Now notice what I have done with this waistband, and I always do this when it's kind of heavy fabric. If it's lightweight fabric, then I don't worry about it, but if it's heavy, I always cut it with the selvage here on the edge so that I don't have on the back side of the band any other bulk by folding over a seam allowance. I instead just use this selvage edge for the back side of it. So when I fuse this down, I am going to take the wider side of this interfacing and I'm going to fuse it so that it's almost out at the edge of the selvage. Then notice that what's on this side, the narrower, the front side of the interfacing, is going to be a 5/8 inch seam allowance so that this will stitch on the front side of the skirt. So as we fuse it, you just need some heat and steam. I usually have it set on, about a wool setting. You can use a press cloth or not. It's quite all right if you put the iron directly on it. And once we get that fused, and of course if you have a very long piece, it's easier, quicker to do it on a press than it is with an iron. It takes a little less time, and you can get it on very evenly. After you finish this, depending on the fabric, sometimes you might want to, right now I'm pressing, I'm just holding it here in place. But if you then see some impressions on the right side, which you don't of course on this stripe, but if you would see some impressions on the right side, then it would be a good idea after it's fused to iron over it like that, to just rub over it, smooth over it, so that it will erase all those impressions and it'll all be looking just right. Okay, then once we have this all fused, we are ready to put this on the skirt. And what I have here is a very small part of a skirt. I have already put the zipper in, and this is just a way I've heard so many of you say, I really have a problem with the zipper in that I have a hard time getting around that tab when I first started out. The next zipper that you make, why don't you try this? Why don't you see what it works out like if you just make a longer zipper than usual instead of the ordinary 7 inches, get an 8-9 inch one, and have that extra sticking up above here. Then when you actually sew on the zipper, the tab's way up here out of the way. It's in this position, way up here above the skirt as you sew it on. After you have it sewn on, then you of course can unzip that zipper, put on your waistband, and after you've stitched across that, then you can very easily cut off the top part of the zipper. So this might be a lot easier for you if you have a hard time putting on zippers and getting around that tab and making straight lines. So I've already put in the zipper. I've also already put on the back side of the waistband just to save a little time. And you can see that this waistband is finished. I've kind of exaggerated the back of it here just so that you can see it more easily. But this is how I did it. I'm going to do the same thing on the front. Usually on the back of the waistband, on the back side of it, is where you would have that extra tab, that lap under, so that the front then covers it up. So here's where I have, about 1.5 inches just to make room for the hook and eye. It might also be a little insurance policy if you think you might put on about 1 inch. You could do that and just reset the waistband and have plenty of fabric there still. So what we're going to do here is put right sides together. Now remember that I had a seam allowance left up here after I had it interfaced. So this seam allowance is going to start right here by putting the edges together, and I'll put that over here and get my pin cushion on. And I'm extending it, about 5/8 of an inch past the actual skirt, because I'm going to have a seam, of course, there on the end. So I'll put it here. The top of it, I'm just butting the edges so that they're even, or putting them up there so that they are even. And I'm going to pin this in place. Now, something else I often hear from women is the fact that they have a problem if they put this waistband on just flat like this, just flat with the skirt. It might be a good idea for you, instead of having everything just perfectly flat here, it might be a good idea to do your pinning from the skirt side and curve it as you're doing that, because as you curve it, you can build in a little bit of ease. If you just need a little bit and keep curving it like this, what happens by the time you keep curving it over your hand and putting the pins in, if you then straighten it back out again, what you will see is that that pink skirt on top is a little bit bigger. It's going to sort of bulge a little bit between each pin, and that's kind of good. It'll never show when you have it on, and yet it takes care of the roundness, your hips, the roundness there. So it might be the best way to do that. So think, if you have some roundness immediately under your waist, try to get in some ease like this. If you have none, if you're pretty much a straight line as you come down from your waist, then don't build in the ease. You don't need it, and it will only bubble out, and you don't want it there. So anyway, I'll pin all this on, and I'm pinning back on the other side. Now, it would be a good idea to keep all the pins on the same side. I can possibly just move these quickly to the front. And then we're ready to stitch. And of course, it makes it very easy to stitch because you just stitch right along the edge of the interfacing. So it gives you a good line. You have a double line actually here. You can either use the line on your machine on the throat plate that says 5/8, or you can just stitch right along the edge of that interfacing, and either way it's going to make it kind of easy for you. So here I'm just stitching this on right along here, and if your machine doesn't like pins, be sure that you do stop and take out the pins before you come to each one. What am I doing here? I have something caught. There we are. So take the pins out or stitch over them as your machine prefers, and once you come all the way to the end, notice that by now I am at this time stitching over that zipper, and that means that right now I could at any time, and I would right about now, go ahead and cut off the end of the zipper. I no longer need it there since I've stitched over it. It's not going to come apart in any way. So I'd cut off the thread short and cut off the zipper so I no longer have so much there. And then I'm going to be ready to finish it up. It's a good idea right about now to do a little pressing. Maybe I can just, no, I can't just reach the iron. I'll stand up to do that. But do press it down flat here. It's going to make your job a little easier if you do that. And of course the seam allowances go up into the belt. So I've pressed this down, and I am going to then fold it with the right sides together, fold it like this, and stitch along the ends. Now for those of you who have been sewing forever, you have done this so many times that you've seen this, but I did get a lot of letters this time from women who were kind of new at the game, and they said, but I don't know how to do a lot of those basic things. Could you show just a few of them on your program? So this is kind of a basic thing for those who haven't done this very much. So okay, right sides together, and I'm going to fold this zipper and these seam allowances out of the way because I don't want them. And then I'm just going to stitch right along the edge of the interfacing here. so that I can get that belt end stitched down flat. And here again, I'll just back stitch a little bit and come forward and back stitch again. And then I'm ready to do a little grading. Now grading is just really important. What it is, how it differs from trimming. If I would trim, I'd cut all this off in one operation and do nothing layered. But usually grading's a good idea here because that bevels all the edges. It puts them all in a little different position so that there's no bulk anywhere, so it distributes the bulk. So I would probably start out like this and cut this one very short, and then cut this one back here a little bit longer, and this one back here I'll trim off a little bit still more, so that they're all kind of graded. They're at different places. And then when you turn this right side out, be sure that corner pokes out. I don't have my little corner turner right here with me, so I'm going to do something everybody tells you not to do. I'm going to put my scissors there and pull the point up, but do it very carefully so that nothing nasty will happen. And then all I have left to do, probably I'd press this, but in the interest of saving a little time, I probably won't. If this would be heavier fabric, by the way, also grade these edges. This is such thin fabric that I'm just leaving both of these long. But it would be a good idea, if it's heavier fabric, to grade one or both of them. For instance, the waistband I might come down about this short width, and then the skirt itself down here I'd trim a little bit less so that they also come out in different places. And then with this, put toward the back side and put a few pins down there if you need to so that it does hold it straight and flat. Then I'm going to stitch in the ditch. As I said, I've exaggerated a little bit on this. You can see how the back of the waistband comes way down beyond, and this is just so that you can very easily see what happens when it's stitched in the ditch. And what that ditch is that I'm talking about is the one right here where the skirt meets the waistband. Here's the ditch. I want to stitch right here. You can whip the back side down by hand if you want to, but as long as you have that nice little ditch here and a machine, you can do the process a lot more quickly. So here you have to decide what foot. I could leave on the general purpose foot as I have right now. I could also use a straight stitch foot, which sometimes works out well, and that just has a single little hole in the plate there. Or what I'm going to use is a buttonhole foot, and the reason for this is because right here on the edge it does stay so well in place and make sure that you do a nice straight line of stitching. So I'll just transfer this foot and put the buttonhole foot on instead and do this stitching right in the ditch. Now if you might be tempted to use another foot that you have that looks logical, it's the this foot. It's the one that you do blind hem with, but think of where those gradations are. Notice how that with this the wrong side is lower and the other side is higher. So that would mean the bulk of it would have to go through the arm of your machine. So that's why I'm not using that foot. But with this one I can then stitch in the ditch here very nicely. Take the pins out if your machine is happier with it, but just right along the edge of that. And even though I am sewing in navy on a pink fabric, I won't even bother to do the whole thing. But it really doesn't show that terribly much. Right here is where the stitching is, below the waistband and above the skirt, just where they meet. That's stitching in the ditch. Done in pink, it wouldn't show at all. Now you can do the very same thing if you have one of those elevator waists that come in and out so frequently from one part of the day to the next, or from one part of the week to the next. You can do this with elastic also. And here again, there are several elastics on the market, and they're various widths. Now notice all of these have some ridges in them, some up and down ridges. And the reason for these ridges is because this is non-roll elastic. You don't really want it to roll. Therefore, be sure you do choose something like this. And here again, it might be wider, narrower, whatever is your choice, your preference. Okay, I have sort of about a 1-inch one here, and I've already put the back side on, and you can see that does elasticize considerably. Some people would prefer to just have partial interfacing and the other part elastic. I'm doing the whole band that way. And so one way to do it, many, many ways, but one way to do it is like this. There's no interfacing in that band. I already have the front of the band sewn on as you saw previously, but before I had interfacing in it. Well, this time instead of having the interfacing in, it's just the one layer of fabric. And I've sewn that on, I've pressed it up so that the seam allowances, the waistband all go up. And then I'm going to take this elastic, which is cut, probably 2-3 inches smaller than my waist, because you do want it to tighten a little bit, and yet it is going to stretch out enough so that when you're the biggest, it will accommodate you. And I'm going to put that next to the skirt, you know, on this area of the waistband that's close to the skirt. I'm going to put it there. I'm going to overlap the raw edge here about 3/8, and I've pinned it in place. And I'm just going to sew that down on machine so that it holds there. I would then do the very same thing on the other end of the elastic, and I need to be kind of careful here so that I don't hit a pin, because especially when you're sewing through elastic, it's so easy to hit a pin and do something that you don't want to do, and I'll back stitch then. And with this stitched in place, I would take this around to the other end of the belt and do the same thing. Now don't twist the elastic when you do that. Make sure that you keep it straight or you're in trouble. It won't lie firmly or flat inside your waistband. But I would take this around to the very opposite end of the waist and do the very same thing by stitching it there and sewing it down. Well, since I just have a partial skirt here, I already have the other part done. Therefore, I'm only going to do this one end, forget about the other end, since it actually would be way around over here is where the other end would be. So with this done, with that just overlapped about 3/8 of an inch and stitched down in place, then I'm going to be able to, as I did last time, fold over right sides together, stitch through this, and after I've stitched through this, just right along the edge of the skirt, I'll turn it over the opposite way this time from the way I did it last time, so that maybe you can see this a little bit more easily. And I'm just going to stitch right along here. And after I do that stitching, back stitch a little and come forward there, and back stitch again. Okay, after I do this, I could also trim it off a little bit if I needed to, certainly trim off the thread ends. And then it's going to be turned right side out. And here again, one of those little point turners work very well that I don't have in my hand. So I'll just push this out with my finger, or you might use the help of your scissors again, as long as you're careful about it. And then where I actually want this elastic to be is not where I have it right now, which is in back of the band or between the band and the seam allowances. I really want this elastic to be between the waistband front and all the seam allowances. So I'm going to tuck it in there and put the seam allowances and the zipper over it, tuck the back side down over it, and I'll keep tucking it in here. And then after you have all this in place, put a few pins in to hold it as you need to do. And then you would stitch in the ditch from the right side the very same way. Now what makes this easy? Remember that the waistband is going to be longer and the elastic's going to be shorter, but what makes it kind of easy is you just start out by putting it there in the groove so it's right between those layers. Put it down there in that groove, get it all folded around nicely and put your pins in wherever they need to be. And then as I would stitch this, it's flat here. And as I get up to about here, I would probably stop. Why don't I do that? I'm going to be stitching backwards this time, but that's okay. I'll still leave the same foot just to save a little time. This would be a place, though, if you have plenty of room to go through here, this would be a good place to put on that other foot, the blind hem foot, and stitch with it instead. Now this is so unbulky, there is so little bulk here that I really won't worry about it. I'll just go ahead and stitch. And because this is stitching in the ditch, I am stitching backwards, or back stitching. And this also will just be stitched in the ditch all the way down. Now, can you see that I'm not doing a really wonderful line of stitching here? And probably the reason for that is because I'm not using the right foot since I have this turned around. I actually should have put on that blind hem foot, and it would have done a better job. Now I'm having to push this a little bit to make it stitch where I want it to stitch. Whereas if I would just use the proper foot for it, I wouldn't have to do that. Anyway, as I get about down toward the end of this, and I'm going to put my needle in the down position so that when I stop, the needle will stop in. That way I can lift the presser foot, I can pull the elastic down this way and kind of gather it up on the waistband, and then with it pulled down so that I again have a straight place to stitch, put the presser foot down and keep on stitching. I'm going to pull this out to show you it doesn't look great, and that's just, get the needle back up, come on. That's just the result, as I said, of not using the right foot. So be sure you get the right feet. See what this looks like now? It isn't quite as good as it should have been. Now, I could have done better had I been leaning over it instead of leaning back out of the way, had I really tried, but I wanted to illustrate a point here. Anyway, however you do this, a very simple process, whether you interface it or whether you do elastic on it, it still is just very simple, and I'm sure you can all do it very well. Well, when the skirt is finished, you might want to make a special belt to give a completed look, an accessorized look to it. So I'll just tie one on and make this look a little bit more finished, because every skirt seems to need a belt. But next week, we're going to move up a little and look into the possibilities in blouses with tie collars, like this one that I had on a recent show. It has this collar here, so and it's tie. So come join me next time, and we'll just tie one on.